Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. It's been a while since we had a Cliff Dwellers episode. All right. Well, we did say like this was going to be decision week. It seems like the decision is being made. Oftentimes Bitcoin kind of knows what's up first. But anyways, right now Bitcoin is back at 9A. A lot of things are happening in the Cryptoverse right now. I do think obviously it'll lead to, some emotional um decisions and whatnot, but let's try to go through this and think through how this is playing out, because a lot of the things we have talked about could finally be playing out. Now, when we made these predictions, at the beginning of 2022, I had no idea it was going to take this long for all Bitcoin pairs to go to the range lows, but I mean, it looks like it's happening, right? And this is one of those things where we did a couple of videos on this recently saying that, look, if Powell comes out in 2025 and says no into QT, it really could be sort of the nail in the coffin for all Bitcoin pairs that could finally send them to their range low. Remember, last cycle, all Bitcoin pairs did not bottom until the Fed ended quantitative tightening. And this cycle, it's been sort of a game of chicken, right? Where I think a lot of people keep thinking that they're going to end it, and then they just don't. And then alts just keep on bleeding. Now, remember, alts are different on their Bitcoin pairs than their USD pairs. The general understanding, right, is that as long as quantitative tightening continues, then the most likely outcome is that when Bitcoin goes up, alts bleed, and then when Bitcoin goes down, alts bleed. Now you're seeing sort of the most brutal part of it, where Bitcoin goes down and alts bleed. The week just started, and alts are already down almost 11% against Bitcoin. And Bitcoin's down a lot. Alts are down 11% against Bitcoin, which Bitcoin by itself is down 5%. So alts are getting absolutely hammered here. Now, others Bitcoin, the Degen's choice metric, is at 0.13. Now, I will say this, we talked about this a lot. This is playing out exactly like last cycle. Remember what we said? Others Bitcoin last cycle was down 60, up 60, down 60, and that's how it bottomed. Up 60, down 60. Sorry, down 60, up 60, down 60. It's the same thing, right? Down 60, up 60. It's currently down around 52. It's not that much further for it to be down 60%, at which point you might finally see others Bitcoin bottom. But guys, I got to tell you, this is not the story of the day. This is the story of the day. Perhaps it is finally time, after all these years, to welcome Ethereum home. It's almost there. We are about to cross into Ethereum's home, and it looks like it's happening as I speak. 2200. For reference, home 2218. There you have it, guys. Ethereum has officially entered into the lower logarithmic regression trend line. I mean, this is crazy. I mean, crazy good that it's finally freaking happening after all these years. 2172, 2143. Ethereum's finally going home. Now it's going to make people believe that it's dead, but this was always going to happen, right? This was always going to happen. It's not about anything with Ethereum. Like I actually think Ethereum has a really bright future for the people that can see past today. But objectively, it always made sense for it to go to the lower logarithmic regression trend line. Always. Because it's what it always does. Right? It's what it always does. So Ethereum has now entered it. right? We can no longer say that it hasn't gone to its lower logarithmic regression trend line. It is now tagged it. Now, the lower logarithmic regression trend line ranges, it's a range. It starts at $1,000, okay? And it goes up to 2,200, right? So 1,000 to 2,200. We just went into it. Now, a lot of people are blaming this on tariffs and all that good stuff, right? You know, Heinemann for tariffs. Guys, listen, think about what happened the last two times the Bank of Japan raised rates. The Bank of Japan raised rates in. Look at me, I'm talking. You guys can't even see the damn screen. Why aren't you guys fixing this for me? Hold on. There we go. Okay. Ethereum is in the lower logarithmic regression trend line now, right? It's in the lower logarithmic regression trend line now. It just wicked into it. So here the thing is, right? This was always going to happen. The key thing to remember, because again, this is going to be one of those things where, like, if you focus on the emotional aspect of it, it's easy to kind of forget about what we talked about, right? What happened when the Bank of Japan raised rates in March? What happened? ETH capitulated in April. And then when the Bank of Japan raised rates in July, ETH capitulated in August. This time, the Bank of Japan has raised rates in January, and ETH is potentially capitulating in February, right? So it's playing out the exact same way, right? You have these major capitulations occurring the month after the Bank of Japan raised rates, right? That's essentially what's happening. It's happening the month after that the Bank of Japan raised rates. So this is historic to some degree because, well, ETH has finally gone to its lower logarithmic regression trend line. Now, here's the thing. Take a look at Bitcoin dominance. 63%. Here we got, guys, 63%. It goes to show you, right? I mean, until the Fed ends QT, which I think they're going to do, probably by March. I said this was a likely outcome. If we go into the January meeting and they don't end QT, the markets could capitulate and they'll probably reverse course in March. That's what or beforehand. 63%. Now, if you look at ETH Bitcoin, 0.025. This is what it's taking, I guess, for alt Bitcoin pairs to finally go to the range lows, for ETH Bitcoin to absolutely get annihilated. Now, one of the things I've mentioned many, 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 many times, if you go over to ultrasound money, what have we talked about? I said that one potential bottom marker for ETH Bitcoin this cycle could be that when the supply of ETH reaches the pre-merge supply, it's basically there. It's really close, but it's basically there. That doesn't necessarily mean ETH USD has to bottom. I mean, you could see ETH Bitcoin get a bounce and Bitcoin USD take ETH USD down with it. But this is, you know, it's really close. Look at the gas fees right now, 685. Normally, this is like 4 or 5. This is, I mean, they've got to be burning through a lot of ETH right now. Look at this. Almost 500 in an hour. You can see that over the last day, it was up 1,300. At one point, it was up over 2,000. And they've gone through 500 in an hour. In an hour. This is what it took, I guess, for all Bitcoin pairs to finally get that move to the, you know, to where they would theoretically go. I mean, if you look at, I mean, a Bitcoin right now is at 93K. So, I mean, right now, Bitcoin's just back of the range low, all things considered. But if you look at all Bitcoin pairs, 0.35. 0.35. Now, the reason why that's important is because we know, historically, 0.25 is the range low. 0.25. We're already at 0.35. This is a new low for the cycle, right? And it's not even really that much further to go, right? From the low, it's only another 30, not even 30. I'm so used to saying 30, right? 24%. It's down 11% today. You know, it's down 11% today. I mean, just triple that up, right? Bitcoin dominance excluding stables. Look at that. Fake out down. Now it's getting that move above the wedge. major move, right? Major move by basically the entire asset class. Dominance now at 63. It looks like it went all the way up to 64, right? It looks like it went all the way up to 64. And here, if we look at, I wonder what futures are looking like. Yeah, the Russell's down like 3%. The NASDAQ's down about 3% as well. One of the things that I want to remind people of is the way this is likely going to play out is going to be very nuanced. And I've tried to explain a lot of these nuances as best I can. But what I think is going to happen, I want to be clear, right? And I put out a tweet about this not too long ago. What I said was, you're likely going to see Bitcoin dominance surge above 60. When that happens, the market will sell off and ETH goes home. We just saw that happen, right? The next thing that will happen, I think, let me show you guys the tweet. Let me just move this over here. All right, here's the tweet. Maybe this. Let me see if I can. All right. Bitcoin dominance goes above 60. Then market sells off, ETH goes home. Right? We're checking these boxes already. The next thing that should occur, the Fed will end quantitative tightening. That should be the next thing that occurs. The Fed ends QT. Now, I don't know when that's going to be. Trump has already said he's not that concerned about the market reaction. He will be concerned about the market reaction at some point. The question is how much pain does the market need to endure before he starts to care? So my guess is that this is the next step, that once we reach the pain level that is needed for Trump to start caring and for Powell to sort of minimize the damage, the Fed will end quantitative tightening. That's what I think is going to happen. So we've already completed step one. We're in the process of step two right now, right? We're in the process of step two as we speak. All right. Step three, the Fed ends QT. Fed ends quantitative tightening. That should be what happens next. Now, it could still be a little ways off. I don't know if the Fed's going to come through intermeeting. Probably not. But, you know, if they don't, the next meeting by the Fed isn't until March 19th. So about 6 weeks from now. About 6 weeks. So let's suppose that the Fed does end quantitative tightening. What would that mean? Well, what it would likely mean is that these things, like others Bitcoin, all Bitcoin pairs, would likely bottom whenever they end quantitative tightening. Now, if they end it tomorrow, maybe all Bitcoin pairs bottom tomorrow. If they end it in March, that's probably when all Bitcoin pairs bottom, would be in March. But again, I mean, it's been sort of a game of chicken between people trying to figure out when it's going to happen and front running it and then being let down because it keeps not happening. So that's how I think it's going to play out. I think the next key thing is going to be the Fed ending quantitative tightening. That doesn't mean you can't rally between now and then. I mean, there's going to be all sorts of rallies, but I think that'll be the next thing, is that the Fed will end quantitative tightening. Now, after they do, I would assume, but I could be wrong, I would assume that the market would then get a sizable rally from that level, right? But again, you might not get a more sustained rally until that happens. As the year goes on, I mean, the macro probably, very well could get worse, and then maybe you finally get a recession. One of the things you have to remember, and we've talked a little bit about this, is, if you look at like the S&P in the 90s, we've made a lot of comparisons between that and ETH, in fact, right? If you look at what the S&P did right here, right, sort of a triple top and then sort of a final lower low, you have to wonder if ETH is following something similar, right? A triple top followed by a lower low, right? Kind of the same thing, right? And if it plays out, I think everyone's going to give up on it, but I think it'd be a great opportunity, honestly. I mean, hell, if ETH did go down there, which it's already gone. I mean, it looks like it's already gone home at this point. But if it did go all the way down there, look, I mean, it would just be connecting the dots, right? 1, 2, and 3, drop, and then rally. That's exactly what the S&P did in the 1990s. So definitely an outcome where that is what happens. Um, it's going to be somewhat difficult, I think, over to navigate this market this year because volatility often picks up in post-halving years. And a lot of people aren't usually ready for it, but you got to be ready for it. And I think it's taking people off guard this time because Bitcoin dominance is still going up. But remember, whatever your top prediction is for dominance, until quantitative tightening ends, it can always go higher, right? That's the thing, right? Until QT ends, dominance can go higher. And that's exactly what happened last cycle, right? I mean, and again, I know it's not like we have a ton of data points, but it hasn't let us down yet. Until it ends, dominance can keep going up. And it's funny because like dominance went to 60, and then everyone's like, well, does that mean it has to stop? No, I mean until the Fed pivots, you could just see the same thing, and that's why when you look at alt Bitcoin pairs, it's remember what I said about ETH. In order for ETH Bitcoin to go up, what did I say? What did I say? I mean, in order for ETH Bitcoin to go up, what has to happen? You have to have a market panic. Welcome to the market panic, right? The only way the degens can get what they want is for the degens to get wrecked first. Because if the degens don't get wrecked first, then how do they get what they want? Because until there's a reason for the Fed to pivot, all Bitcoin pairs bleed. Doesn't mean all USD pairs can't go up. If Bitcoin goes up, it'll lift the altcoin market with it. But what you want to see, the reason why everyone's so depressed this cycle is because alts just keep on bleeding back to the king, And you can go look at like the advanced decline index of the top 100 cryptocurrencies and see exactly what I'm talking about. It's been at a downtrend since 2021. And look at this drop right here. It's dropping again. It could very well go put in a lower low. The bull market, you guys remember from 2020 to 2021, the ADI was putting in higher highs. Ever since 2022 began, the ADI has been putting in lower highs. So I think that's why this bull market feels kind of bad for a lot of people, is because they've mostly not been in Bitcoin. They've been in a lot of other cryptocurrencies that have not only not gone to all-time highs, but have just been slowly bleeding. If you look at ETH dominance, look at it. Look that, I mean, it went there. I mean, it went to exactly where we said it was going to go, to 9 to 10%. There it is. We've had this trend line drawn for what, 3 years now? I'm curious what ETH market cap divided by Bitcoin market cap looks like. Look at that. Look at that. It's getting pretty low. So I think there's going to be some major trend reversals in the coming weeks on alt Bitcoin pairs. But in order to get the trend reversal you want on alt Bitcoin pairs, I still do think that you're likely going to see alt Bitcoin pairs go a little bit lower. Now, it's possible that this is the low. If it's, we talked, how many times we talk about this being an expanding, broadening wedge? So with that in mind, it's possible that alt Bitcoin pairs bounce around these levels, right? It's possible. Okay. I mean, look, that's where it is, right? The sort of the expanding, broadening wedge, it's still playing out. I would say this: if you want a real alt Bitcoin rally like that or like that, then you probably want to go down here first. If you don't go down there, it doesn't mean you can't see alt Bitcoin pairs rally. They rallied from these levels in November. They rallied a little bit from these levels in June and in last November and last June, right? So it's not that it can't rally from these levels. They certainly can. It's just that in order to get a rally that's going to take them above this, I think you might have to see them go down here first, right? So if they go down here, if they break this wedge and they go down here, I think the Fed pivots hard back to, away from quantitative tightening, and then you get a big move up by alt Bitcoin pairs. But again, it's that thing, especially as you talk about like ETH Bitcoin, or you think about like ETH Bitcoin, the only way you can get the Fed to pivot from QT to QE or just from QT to nothing is to get the panic in the market. And one of the things we've talked about is if you look at like the S&P divided by M2, this is essentially the same level that it got rejected at in 1998 before there was a panic and the market dropped like 20%. And then the market got a big bounce out of even that level, right? And I have to imagine a lot of people thought the bull market was over and it dropped and then it got an even bigger bounce out of that. So do keep that in mind, right? Just because there's a panic doesn't mean things have to be over. But one thing that I do go back to, and the only reason I'm going to keep going back to it is until the market can prove that it's no longer a valid comparison, which is I hope is what the market does. I really do. But remember, the QQQ was launched in 1999 and it topped out exactly 54 weeks later. We know that, right? It was 54 weeks later when it topped. From here to the top was 54 weeks. Bitcoin has done the exact same thing. Remember, we said inauguration day is 54 weeks later. That's when Bitcoin topped. Now, here's the thing. The structure is a little bit different, right? I don't really think it's exactly the same thing. You can see that the QQQ, it was just basically straight up during this period through March. Bitcoin, it had some longer consolidation period, right? It's not the exact same thing. And I really don't think it's the exact same thing. I really don't. But if Bitcoin were to get a larger correction to say what the QQQ did, remember the QQQ ended up dropping all the way down from 120 down to 63 before getting a large bounce back up to over 100. 63, if Bitcoin were to go that low, which I don't really know that it has to, there's plenty of other support levels it could bounce off between now and then, but you can see that if Bitcoin were to just simply backtest this trend line that it broke out from, that would basically be around 63K, right? If you connect those lower highs and you just say, all right, well, if it goes to that trend line, that's essentially 63K. Again, does it have to go that low? No, but in order for ETH to go lower into the logarithmic regression trend line, right? In order for it to go lower into it, Bitcoin would have to get a larger drop, right? It would have to get a larger drop. So we could actually do a little back of the envelope math if you guys want to. We'll go over our trusty friend Wolfram Alpha over here and say, well, it's going to be dependent on ETH Bitcoin as to where Bitcoin we need to go for Ethereum to say go to the middle part of the regression band, which it doesn't have to, right? I mean, it's in the regression band now, but let's just say I went to the middle of it, around 1500. Let's say I went to around 1500. What would ETH have to be at the current ETH Bitcoin valuation? Or sorry, what would Bitcoin have to be at the current ETH Bitcoin valuation, right? So the current ETH Bitcoin valuation is 0.026, right? So if you think about that, right, if ETH is well, ETH is currently 2,500, but what would it actually have to be? So we're gonna say Bitcoin's price. So we want to know Bitcoin's price times 0.026 would equal 1,500, right? That's essentially what you're doing to solve for X, right? You're solving for the price of Bitcoin. That would be 57K, right? 57, 58K. That's a lot, right? That's a lot. If ETH were to not go to 1,500, let's say it were to drop at say 1,800, that would be around a $70,000 Bitcoin. One of the things to keep in mind, and I remember this, we've talked about it a lot before. One of the things to keep in mind is that in the 2017 cycle, when Bitcoin got a correction that also, by the way, started in January, it had this correction right here and it dropped about 35%. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because the drop that Bitcoin got, it retested the 2016 high, right? So the drop in 2017 tested the 2016 high before the bull market continued, right? So let's just do away with the QQQ comparison for a minute, right? Let's do away with the negative view, and let's just try to see, like, if the market can remain bullish later on this year and it were to play out like the 2017 cycle, what would have to happen, right? Well, in 2017, the correction in January that kickstarted in January of the post-halving year corrected to the 2016 cycle high. Now, if you look at the same thing for this cycle, it would not mean 63K. It would actually mean around 73K, right? It would mean 73K. So you have to think, right? I mean, if Bitcoin were to go down to 73K, it would feel pretty bad, right? It would. But if it did, it'd still be doing the same damn thing it did in 2017. Same thing, right? Not really a huge difference. And by the way, I mean, it'd even be the same percent drop too, right? From that high. That not even. I mean, it's a 32% drop. This cycle has been so difficult because, anyone sort of waiting for those 30% drops, with the exception of last year, they haven't gotten them. The market just hasn't given that much back. So now it's almost like sacrilegious to suggest that Bitcoin could drop 30% because it doesn't usually do that. But just know that in 2017 we did get a 30% drop, and it went down. It went down there. So then you could also go back to Wolfram and sort of do the reverse and say, well, what if Bitcoin were to just bottom at 73K, and then you say that the bottom for ETH Bitcoin, if it's 0.026, and then you solve for X, what would the price of ETH be? It would be about 1900, which in that case, if it's just 1900, it would essentially just be a double bottom, right? It would be a double bottom there. Which, by the way, I mean, it just went to 2127, right? It just went pretty low. But I also, I still kind of go back to the same idea that we've talked about. And I keep thinking, like, is this really just what needs to happen? Where, like in the 2016 cycle, ETH checked in with this 3 times. And it was the third tag of the trend line, which marked the ETH Bitcoin bottom, right? That's what marked the ETH Bitcoin bottom. So what happens if ETH USD does tag that trend line in March? When the Fed potentially ends quantitative tightening, then you could get an ETH Bitcoin bottom, an ETH USD bottom, and then we can hopefully more sustainably go up. Now, the crazy thing is that, everyone's been fighting each other for the last 3 years, debating whether ETH was going to go home or not. And the problem is that neither side has really gotten what they wanted. I mean, there's obviously a lot of people that were hoping to see it go home, a lot of people that weren't really wanting to see it go home. The problem is it never really went anywhere. It just kind of stayed up here forever. This is the same pattern that it did over here, right? And you had sort of 3 peaks before the final sell-off that led into the ETH Bitcoin bottom. 1, 2, and 3, right? 1, 2, and 3. It's the same thing. 1, 2, 3. And I think potentially we're just sort of in the final sell-off now. I don't know exactly where the bottom is, but I could definitely see ETH going below $2,000. And it doesn't mean it has to happen right away, but I could see it happening. If it were to follow the 2016 cycle, it would be a lower low compared to what it did in July. Not necessarily what it did over here in 2022, but it would likely be lower than 1911, which is where the low was back in August, if it's going to play out like 2016, and or if it's going to mimic what the S&P did in the 1990s when we sort of got that 20% drop in the S&P, and then the markets did okay. The one way I could see people go awry here is to assume that even if we do get a recession, right, that they all are the same. And it's true that you get 50% recessions, 50% drops. But remember, in the 1990s, we had a recession, 1990 to 1991, and the S&P only dropped 20%, right? And then it was right back off to the races, and the rest is history. So I would urge you not to get complacent, because I could easily see ETH bottoming out, maybe in the next month or two, and then hopefully getting a pretty big rally after that. But I just think that the reason all this stuff has been taking so long is because the degens have just held on a lot longer than they did last cycle. Last cycle, the degens gave up a lot earlier in the cycle, right? In the pre-halving year, in fact, is when the degens finally gave up and all Bitcoin pairs went to the range lows. This cycle, they never gave up. And by the way, I mean, there's a chance they're not giving up here either. I mean, if all Bitcoin pairs just hold the lows. Last cycle, remember, all Bitcoin pairs didn't even go to the range low. They left the range low in November of the post-halving year. So you could even get an example where it kind of bounces back out of this and then doesn't fall down here until later on. Now, I hope that's not the way it goes. I would actually prefer something like this, where it maybe just goes down here, bounces again, and then goes up, or something like that. But I do know that if the Fed ends quantitative tightening, there would be no great reason to remain super bearish on all Bitcoin pairs. It's just that the reason I've remained bearish on all Bitcoin pairs, which given the chart today is justified, is because it just never ended quantitative tightening, you know? And I never thought it was going to take this long, right? If you had told me in 2022, we'd be sitting here in February 2025 and all Bitcoin pairs are still going lower because the Fed never ended QT, I'd be like, no, there's no way it's going to take that long. But here we are. And you have to adjust to what the market's going to tell you and what the Fed's doing and just say, look, until something changes, that's the most likely outcome. Um, I have often thought, and I've said this many, many times. I have often thought if the transition from from for the ETH supply to sort of reach that pre-merge supply, I've always wondered if it would mark the bottom for ETH Bitcoin. Now I don't know for sure, and maybe it doesn't even go below zero with the gas fees like they are, but I've always wondered if that would actually mark the bottom for ETH Bitcoin. And it was supposed to happen tomorrow, but since the gas fees are up so much, it's not going to happen on Monday. And it might not happen. I mean, maybe it doesn't happen until, say, 2026 or something. But, just because ETH Bitcoin is still going down, I mean, I think a lot of it is related to the Fed. ETH dominance has hit the target we said back in 2022. I said 9 to 10%. It just went down to 9.23, right? So the ETH dominance target is hit. Bitcoin dominance target is more than hit. The only thing now, all Bitcoin pairs, I think they got to throw in the towel too. I don't know when. Maybe they bounce again, but I do ultimately think they will throw in the towel at some point. If we were to go look at Bitcoin dominance plus ETH dominance, you can see that just wicked above all the prior highs from this cycle, right? That's a crazy wick too. I'd also like to go take a look at Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance plus USDC dominance plus ETH dominance. Look at that, right back up to 82%. Oh, faithful, right? Anytime the market goes down, this metric back up to 82%. I wonder where USDT dominance is. Maybe this is what we should look at. So it is back above the 20-week moving average, right? So I mean, I guess in the short term, this is still like just a double bottom off USDT dominance, but that doesn't mean that you can't get more moves. And I know the sort of the QQQ comparison is scary. I get that, and I'm not even saying that it's the most likely outcome. I'm just saying that like it's important to remember that things like that exist, and if we do get a left translated peak where the market just tops out in January and it doesn't, and then that's it, there's still likely going to be a macro lower high that would occur in, say, the second or third quarter of the year. Now, I hope the market is able to give us more than that, but it's just something to keep in mind. These drops, like, that you're seeing today are not something that a lot of people even considered. So you have to remember, it's always important to consider all outcomes and to sort of try to figure out, what is the market telling you? And if the Fed's not going to end QT, then this was always a likely thing. There was another tweet I put out, and I'd like to revisit it, because I it seems like it might actually be playing out here. So it looks like this, and I'll just sort of copy it over here so we can look at it. So I said here, right? I mean, I said one risk for ETH is if the Fed comes out this week and says no QE, which they did. Maybe that would cause ETH to finally go home on its USD pair, leading the Fed to reverse course in March 2025, causing a quick recovery. If ETH goes down there, it would probably justify money printing again. So you can see what I drew out, right? Sort of a final drop and then a big rally after it. I think we're in that drop now. I just don't know how low it's going to go. That's the issue. And I can't hope to predict the exact bottom on it, but I do think that is what's currently happening. It's nothing about ETH, it's nothing about all that. It's all related to monetary policy is what I think is happening. So I think ETH is in this drop now that we've been talking about for a long time. You know what? I think we would have gotten this drop a couple months ago had the Bank of Japan raised rates then, but then they chose not to. So it kind of just delayed. It's like it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It just means they delayed it. So had the Bank of Japan raised rates back over here, then you could have already had this move. but they didn't. The carry trade was not allowed to unwind, and therefore you sort of had another move back up, which kind of makes sense if you think about it. I mean, not that I was thinking it was the most likely outcome, but it looks a lot like that, where you have sort of a triple top, right? One, two, and then one final top. That top occurred in September, and then ETH bottomed like 3 months later. So this top was in December. So January, February, March. March is interesting. Why? Because that's when the next Fed meeting is. And maybe that's when the Fed will finally end quantitative tightening. Definitely interesting market, guys. If you're not subscribed here, make sure you subscribe. Give the video a thumbs up. Again, we have the sale on ITC Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Make sure you guys check that out. Anyways, I mean, I think this market is going to be very volatile here over the next couple of weeks. And I would like to see if some of these predictions finally pan out, sort of the remaining predictions, right? The the alt Bitcoin pairs to 0.25. Will it finally happen after all this time? It very well could. In the short term, I would respect the broadening wedge and just know that this might be all we get on alt Bitcoin pairs for a little while. It might just be slowly stepping down. This might be all we get for a little while. But if it does go below this wedge, if it drops below that, then I think the bottom is 0.25 or around there, right? I think that's probably the best case for a bottom if it goes below 0.33. If it goes below 0.33, the most likely outcome for a bottom is probably right around 0.25, which is where it bottomed in September 2019 and in October, November of 2017. Others Bitcoin, if we're thinking about where could that actually bottom, if it does follow last cycle and gets that 60% drop from when the Fed paused, I mean, you're almost there now, but it could go to like 0.1, 0.1, 0.11, something like that. So maybe a little bit further, right? A little bit further, and then it would finally be there after what, 3 years? It's been a long cycle, guys, a really long cycle. Yeah, I mean, those are my thoughts. I do think it is certainly interesting that Ethereum has finally made the move to the regression band. I don't know what we're going to argue about now. Finally is making its way into the lower logarithmic regression trend line. I suppose the most likely area of support for ETH is going to try to hold will be kind of like where it is around 2,500, right? That's where these higher lows have been set, like 1, 2, 3, and then sort of right through here. And then there was a wick right here as well. So it's not impossible for it to try to hold here. But I'm saying, like, if it can't hold at 2,600 and you get weekly closes below 2,600, then it certainly could go sub 2K within the next month or two. At which point it could very well lead into a macro bottom for ETH USD. Yeah, and you could, sort of a more optimistic way to draw this is to look at maybe the candle bodies and not the wicks, and to say that maybe even right there would sort of be good enough to justify a rally to all-time highs. But we'll have to see. I mean, the market tomorrow, when the market opens, I'm sure it's going to be somewhat crazy. The Nasdaq, as you can see, is down around 2.5% or so. It's back at its 20-week SMA. It's back at the 20-week SMA. The S&P, if we go look at that, futures anyways, it's also at the 20-week moving average. So, one outcome I could see is a drop into mid-March, followed by a big bounce out of mid-March, right around the time that the Fed leaves quantitative tightening behind. So I could see that, right? Sort of a drop in a mid-March. And that doesn't mean you can't rally. You probably get a 2-week rally between now and then, but something like that could be the most likely outcome, where you drop, you'd rally, and then you drop hard again in mid-March, and then you rally out of that as the Fed ends quantitative tightening. I think that's a good enough plan as any. Doesn't mean it's going to pan out, but we sort of outlined that previously when we were talking about this right here, right? If the Fed comes out this week and says no QE, maybe that would cause ETH to finally go home. Check. Leading the Fed to reverse course in March 2025, causing a quick recovery. Also, ETH had capitulations in April and August. The Bank of Japan raised rates in March and July. So history shows ETH had capitulation lows the month after the Bank of Japan raised rates. The Bank of Japan just raised rates last week, so maybe a capitulation low in February, March. I don't know, obviously. I don't know if that's what's going to happen, but it seems as good of a plan as any, right? As good of a route as any that you could have come up with a couple of weeks ago, right? Seems as good as a path as any. So that's what I'm going to sort of operate under here to think about and think about how this market might shape up going into the rest of February and March. My guess is that if it does play out like that, you would likely get a sort of a counter trend rally at some point that might back test the bull market support band, kind of like it did over here, right? Kind of like it did right here in July, back up and then down, right? So you could see something like that, right? It's not impossible to get something like that where it gets sort of a counter trend 2-week rally, and then ultimately just collapses into mid-March, causing us to connect the dots, causing the Fed to go to quantitative easing or at least away from QT, and then you get sort of a big rally by ETH USD out of all that. And my guess could very well be to new all-time highs, in fact, if that were to play out. Dominance, by the way, again, it did go up to 64%. So a really big move. I think the most interesting thing, I think, for me, just from an academic perspective, is just all Bitcoin pairs. Like, are they just going to play out like last cycle? Again, guys, make sure you're subscribed if you're not subscribed, and give the video a thumbs up, turn on notifications, all that good stuff. Wow, we got 12,000 people watching. We better have 12,000 likes. We only got 1,500 likes. We got 1,500 likes and 12,000 viewers. That's worse than all Bitcoin pairs. All Bitcoin pairs are holding up better than that. Come on, guys. All Bitcoin pairs are at least at 36%. We're at 10% over here. Unbelievable. I do think ETH dominance is getting pretty low, and I'm not going to be much of a bottom caller on this stuff, but I really don't. I mean, it could go a little bit lower, but I don't think it's going to go that much lower. The reality is that, and look, guys, I mean, this comes from someone who's been bearish on ETH Bitcoin forever. But I do think that whenever QT ends, ETH Bitcoin is going to reverse really hard. Really hard. I just don't know when it's going to be. I wish I had a crystal ball. Maybe March. I mean, at this rate, March or sooner. Let's check in on ADA. What's ADA doing? Yeah, it's below the bull market support band. This is the same wedge we've been talking about, right, forever. I think the issue is that, like, it always tries to go back up here and then break out, but it just can't do it because quantitative tightening continues. And so then eventually it just kind of comes back down. I think you have to move away from QT to ever see this stuff really break out. Yeah, ADA Bitcoin, 653 cents. The thing is like, I still wonder if it's gonna go to 400. It went to like 470. Still wonder if it's not just playing out the same way it played out last year, where it then just sort of fades back down. I can see it doing the same thing. What Link Bitcoin's doing? Link Bitcoin. All right, maybe back down to this trend line here. Sol Bitcoin. Sol Bitcoin to me just looks like ETH Bitcoin delayed by 2.5 years. Right? I mean, it looks like the same thing. I mean, I know it's kind of miserable to think about, but I mean, it is what it is. I don't just remember, I don't control what it is. It just is what it is. And if you look at ETH Bitcoin on a log scale, right, if you look at ETH Bitcoin on a log scale and you go over to Sol Bitcoin and then you overlay this, I mean, it just looks like basically the same thing, right? So I don't know. I mean, I would guess that if you fast forward this a couple of years, like it's just going to look like the same thing as ETH Bitcoin. Unfortunately, could be wrong, but someone says, "Look how negative the sentiment is." Yeah, I think the reason why sentiment is so bad is because, like, on one hand, you have people that are just saying, "Well, look at my USD portfolio. Look at my portfolio against US dollars. It's doing okay." But the reality is that all these alts are still just bleeding back to Bitcoin, right? Like the best strategy for most people was just to stick with Bitcoin, right? And dominance is going to go up, and it preserves the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio. No one can predict where USD valuation of Bitcoin is going to go because no one has a crystal ball. But as long as monetary policy remains restrictive, you're probably better off with Bitcoin than essentially anything else. I think that's why the mood is so bad because alts just keep bleeding against Bitcoin and they keep going to new lows against Bitcoin. That's the issue. And you're not going to see that change more than likely in a durable fashion until QT ends. That doesn't mean you can't have rallies between now and then. It's just that until QT ends, like, that you might not see anything different. Yeah. Sky says probably because Bitcoin went up a lot, but nothing else. Yeah, I think that's the issue, right? And this is why Bitcoin dominance is so important. And I would say next cycle, don't forget Bitcoin dominance. Like at some point in the next few years, like if you ever see Bitcoin dominance like at like 40%, 42, 44%, that's the best time to just jump on the Bitcoin dominance train, right? If you ever see it down here, ignore all the newcomers telling you it's going to go to 30% or 20%. That's how you can kind of tell the difference between someone who's actually been in the cryptoverse for a few cycles and a newcomer that's sort of pretending to be a guru is when Bitcoin dominance is down here, look at what they say. And if they're just calling for it to collapse to 20 or 30%, they have no idea what they're talking about. That's how you tell the difference. And most of the time, they're just doing it to pump their own bags. But I would say that's the time to get on the Bitcoin dominance train whenever Bitcoin dominance is down at these levels. So at some point in the future, when Bitcoin dominance is back down at those levels, just remember the best thing to do is to get on the Bitcoin dominance bandwagon, ignore the noise, and just, preserve the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio. The higher it goes, right? The higher it goes, alts just keep on getting wrecked, right? But I mean, I do think we're potentially coming into this peak right here sometime soon if alt Bitcoin pairs can finally go to their range lows. Someone says petition to start QE. I think the reason that the Fed hasn't done it is because of the inflation rate. I think that's the issue. But I think inflation will likely come back down a little bit as the months go on, especially with market scares like this. So, I wouldn't like I don't think it's going to accelerate in the way that some people think it's going to. Like I don't think it's going to be a repeat of the 1970s. I mean, it could be, but there's nothing at this point in time suggests that's the most likely outcome. If they do go to QE and they just start printing money again, and then the markets and then alt season finally begins, right? We finally get alt season, well after everyone gave up on it, then maybe you see inflation come back. But in the short term, I don't really think it's the most likely outcome. Why does ETH going down justify QE? Do you mean this is going to be accompanied by the drop in the Nasdaq? Yeah, I think the argument is that a drop like this is not enough to justify QE. The only way you're going to really get QE is if the S&P follows suit, right? If like the S&P gets a drop, then you might see it, and it could kick the can down the road on our issues. Check gold. Yeah, gold's at 2,700, but I mean, I do remain macro bullish on gold for probably the next like 5 years, but um, a lot of you guys aren't here to hear me talk about gold, right? Let's be honest. John says it is your first cycle. Learn from this is where you get your battle scars for the future. Yeah, guys, look, the whole Bitcoin dominance train stuff, like, there's the one thing you can try to do is you can try to convince people of it, but you're not going to have much success. The way to truly get someone on the Bitcoin dominance bandwagon is to live through a cycle of it. And then by the time the last person gets it, that's when Bitcoin dominance train is over. By the time you convince the last person. Um, yeah, and look, guys, I mean, no one's perfect. We all make mistakes. Just, learn from it. It's a mistake. You learn from it. You move on, and the next cycle will be even better. Yeah, fib retracement on Bitcoin dominance now. So this is one thing I've mentioned that the next stop could be as high as 66%, right? So the reason for that, if you look at the fib retracement from this level right here, that next fib is the 786, which is right at 66%. So if you see dominance hit 66 as all Bitcoin pairs go to the range low, that could be a milestone for Bitcoin dominance right there, 66%. Why would the Fed end QT? Yeah, they probably won't, at least not immediately. I think if the market keeps panicking like this for another 6 weeks, they probably would. That's the argument. Not that they're going to end it because the market went down. Um, in fact, Powell probably wants to see the degens get wrecked so that it helps bring inflation down, right? Because the people that are if you're making a lot of money on high risk investments, that's I mean, can encourage spending and could be a tailwind for inflation. But if anything, Powell probably wants to see the frothier stuff go down so that inflation can have some headwinds and not be going up so much. Um, Someone says the tariff war with the U.S. is the perfect scenario for a black swan event. I knew that's gonna be the sentiment, but remember the market sold off the last two times the Bank of Japan raised rates. There's always a narrative. There's always a reason for it, but it's kind of playing out the same way it did the last two times. Any thoughts on why XRP is taking the biggest hit? Probably because the risk on it was kind of the highest, right? If you look at it, looks like it actually just got back down to its 21-week EMA. I think one of the reasons why XRP is getting hit harder, if you go over to the risk metrics, so you look at risk, current or historical risk levels. If you look at like Bitcoin risk, it's still in the 0.5 to zero point 0.6 risk band. But if you go to like XRP, it was all the way up at the 0.8 to zero point 0.9 risk band. I mean, it went all the way up to like 0.87 risk. So the risk on it was just a lot higher than a lot of the other coins, right? So I think that's the reason why it's getting hit harder because it was up a lot more. Which I mean is normal. I mean, this, the things that do get those quick pumps up can also be quick to give some of the gains back when the market gets these drops. But I mean, in the short term, it hopefully, if you have a bag of XRP, I'd be watching the bull markets weapon. A lot of alts are already losing that level. I'm not sure if Solana has. It looks like Solana's losing it. Um, Link, yeah, Link has to have lost. I guess the week just started, so we'll see by the end of the week what happens. Bitcoin's still well above it. ETH has got to be well below it. Yeah, well below it. I expected this watching your previous video, noticing Japan rate pattern. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a weird thing that like the Bank of Japan like has some correlation. I'm sure someone else who's gonna be like, it has nothing to do with the Bank of Japan. It's gonna be due to tariffs and whatnot. But again, it all goes back to what I said previously, right? You know, the people that will say that has nothing to do with the Bank of Japan were also the people saying that there's no way it was going to go down, right? And now that it is going down, they'll say, well, it's because of tariffs. There's always a narrative for every price movement, right? If you can't, you know, say it ahead of time, you know, we knew the tariffs were coming. So if you weren't at least looking at the downside ahead of time when you knew the tariffs were coming, you can't then say, well, now that's the reason. Unemployment data this Friday, yeah, that I mean, it's a big week for the labor market data, because we're gonna get all that labor market data this week. We'll see where it comes in at. U.S. Department of Treasury refunding documents released tomorrow will have any effect? I don't think that'll have an effect. No, um, I don't. How close is ETH to going home? It looks like it already has entered into the lower log on the regression trend line. Uh, so yeah, I mean, it looks like it's been moving in that. I mean, this is the first time all cycle it's gone into the regression band. Right, the first time all cycle. Will a good unemployment rate in this bear situation? Depends on how good. If it's too good, it might send the long end of the yield curve. Actually, what is the long end doing right now? It's down a little bit, not a lot. I kind of wonder if one of the ways this might play out for the long end is like a drop down here, and then maybe like a rally, and then like a bigger drop like that. I'm kind of thinking that's what might happen for the 10-year. I could see it happening. And then you sort of get like a double top on the 10-year, and then you get a macro double bottom on something like TLT, which is normally how TLT bottoms, is a macro double bottom or a sort of a macro sweep of a prior low, right? That's how oftentimes TLT sort of bottoms out. So I wonder if you just kind of get the same thing. TXY to 125. I don't know about that. Maybe, but I don't know. Yeah, in the video yesterday, I was sort of pointing out that Nvidia dropping might be sort of a warning sign for Bitcoin, because it was sort of the blue chip of the stock market for the last couple of years. Obviously, the DeepSeek narrative is what people are running with, but um, when Reagan took office, and I think when Nixon took office, the market dropped for a little bit, and then things got better, right? When Reagan took office, we also had an inflation problem. And what happened back then is, you can see, so Reagan took office here. You can see the market. We did go into a recession, but then the market continued on. I mean, it- you know, even if there is a recession, right? It's just an opportunity, right? If you're not going anywhere, if you're still going to be a responsible investor, just create opportunities if and when they happen. So I wouldn't even worry too much about it. If it happens, it happens. It's an opportunity. Um, And at this point, there's no obvious guarantee that it's about to happen anyways. If it does happen like 1990, it might just be one lower low on ETH USD. Actually, you know what? An interesting metric, if you look at US interest rates minus the US 10-year yield, really similar to 1990, in fact. Um, wait, I'm not looking at the right thing. What do I want to look at? When I first got a monthly. Um, US interest rates. Maybe it was a 2-year yield. Yeah, it was a 2-year yield. See, this is 1990, 1989. Tag this down and then up. And as it came up, that's what marked the bottom. So as that came up, that's where the S&P bottomed right there. So watch this, right? If it bounces up, that could be where the market bottoms at that sort of lower high, and then as it goes down, it might repeat what happened over here where the S&P then went up after that. So I would watch that because it is still playing out kind of like that. Now also we had the same sort of setup going into the financial crisis, but you know, hopefully we don't get a 50% drop. That'd be kind of bad. My guess is if you do get a 50% drop, it wouldn't occur until like, later on. It'd be like a 10% drop first, a bounce, and then a larger drop after that. Bitcoin heavy always wins, is true. Someone says looking like a right translated cycle now. It's going to depend on the market reaction whenever the Fed pivots, I think. I guess the key thing here is what's the, what effect, if any, does that have? Yeah, ADA got a big drop as well. Again, I mean, ADA Bitcoin can always go lower, especially until whenever QT ends. So, I mean, I know these rallies are always great and everyone gets excited, but until quantitative tightening ends, I didn't want to be the bad guy, right? I just wanted to tell you guys what's going to happen based on monetary policy. It has nothing to do with my opinions of these chains, right? I mean, like even like BNB Bitcoin, you could argue that it's setting up for a macro double bottom potentially, but I don't know. I mean, we'll see. Someone says ETH went home for a few minutes. It looks like it. I mean, if yeah, I mean, it looks like it went to the lower logarithmic regression trend line, right? Which was always the argument. Yeah, there it is. What does ETH go home mean? Basically, what you normally see is ETH usually goes to its lower logarithmic regression trend line before it gets a rally to all-time highs, right? Trend line, all-time highs. Trend line, all-time highs. Trend line, all-time highs. The reason why ETH has been allergic to 4K for the last 3 years is because it never went home. Had it gone home over here, maybe it would already be at all-time highs, but because it never did, never went to all-time highs. Now it's finally going home. What's the right translated cycle? A right translated cycle is where the peak occurs in Q4 of the post-election year, right? The post-halving year. The last 3 cycles for Bitcoin have been post or right translated, where the peak occurs, and then you get a 1-year bear market, right? A 1-year bear market, a 1-year bear market. They've all been right translated. In history, you do sometimes get left translated cycles where the peak occurs around the election time, right? So like if you go back to the 1970s, you can see that the first sort of venture here, this was a right translated cycle, 3 years up, 1 year down, then was 2 years up, 2 years down, and then 2 years up, 2 years down. Everyone here is probably hoping that it's not about to be 2 years down. And I'm trying to, I think it makes sense to try to find reasons to be optimistic, but to also realize that like there is a chance that that happens if the macro gets away from us, right? The way that you get left translated cycles is if you get unemployment rates and inflation rates that are not well behaved, right? It's these peaks in unemployment and inflation that cause you to get left translated cycles. So, in order to avoid a left translated cycle, the Fed needs to keep the unemployment rate from going too much higher and it also wants to make sure that the inflation data doesn't go higher. If it can engineer a soft landing where this just kind of falls off and this just falls off like here, then you could still have a right translated peak. But if the unemployment rate starts to shoot up too much, then it could end up being left translated. And the reason for that is as stock prices drop, layoffs go up. If layoffs go up, it's sort of a cycle that's hard to get out of. So at this point, you know, the market's not really down that much. If anything, the market's close to all-time highs. But it depends on how much pain the Fed and the new administration, how much pain are they willing to let the markets have before they step in and try to do something different. Make sure you guys subscribe and give the video a thumbs up if you haven't. Again, we are at around 12,000 people watching, but we got 3,500 likes. So our ratio right now is 0.29. So yet again, the like to viewer ratio is worse than alt Bitcoin pairs, right? It's worse than alt Bitcoin pairs. I think the interesting thing about alt Bitcoin pairs is like, you know, just recognizing that it's in this expanding, broadening wedge. I think that's kind of the sort of the kind of an interesting pattern, right? I don't know. I mean, 0.25 still seems like the eventual target, especially if QT doesn't end. By the way, guys, if QT ends and we're not at 0.25, it doesn't matter. I mean, I think you probably just go up at that point because the alts will likely want to have a good reason to go up, and QT ending would be a good reason. But yeah, I would. I mean, if all Bitcoin pairs go down here, then I think it would make sense to be bullish on all Bitcoin pairs. But they're just not down there yet, and it might take half a year for them to get down there if QT just doesn't come back. I don't know. It's not about when, or no, it's not about if. It's just that when it happens, that's usually when the market conditions change. Regarding Bitcoin and crypto, wasn't last cycle left translated? No, peak was in November of 2021. Do you think we get an alt season in 2025? It's going to I mean, honestly, it's going to depend on how the macro evolves, which is why we follow the macro. If the macro evolves in a way so that the unemployment rate just kind of levels off and inflation doesn't spike, then it's still possible. Remember, the alt season that you want that happened in 2021, in 2017 when it happened, it didn't happen until November. So it's not impossible for it to happen. Um, I do see a lot of the people that have spent the last 3 years calling for alt season now saying it's not going to happen, which is funny because the higher Bitcoin dominance goes, you could argue the closer you actually get to alt season because alt season starts from a pretty high Bitcoin dominance level. With that said, there's no guarantee that you get alt season if it's a left translated cycle. If it's left translated, then you don't get an alt season. If it's, well, you still could actually. Maybe you get an alt season on a Bitcoin lower high. Like if Bitcoin to play out like the QQQ, where it gets like a drop and then gets this rally for like 3 or 4 months, maybe that would be alt season. So I would still say there's a chance that you still get alt season. It's just that in order to get it, you need monetary policy to change. And the only way you get monetary policy to change is like you get drops like the one you're seeing right now. It kind of is one of the pieces of the puzzle we've been trying to put together. Is how do you get QE without a drop in the market first? It looks like we're starting to get that drop in the market. So in your opinion, do we need a bigger drop in order for the Fed to start QE? I don't really think the Fed gives, what's a nice way to say it? I don't think Powell gives two sats as to what the crypto market is doing. I think they care about the stock market. I mean, if the stock market drops 10, 15, 20%, then Powell's going to care and they'll probably end quantitative tightening. So, as long as the stock market does okay, I don't think they're going to end QT, but if you see the stock market start to falter, then they probably would. We did say this was decision week and boy has it been. Percentage wise, when was the last time we had a day this bad for alts? Um, in terms of alt Bitcoin pairs, I mean, you've seen days like this before, right? March 2023. I mean, maybe like April 2024. Really similar to really, really, really similar to the when the Bank of Japan raised rates back then too. You know, I think the reality is the bear market for alt Bitcoin pairs never actually ended. The bear market for Bitcoin ended in 2022, but the bear market for alt Bitcoin pairs never actually ended. And others Bitcoin looks even worse. I mean, look at this chart. In fact, the way it worked out last cycle was it was sort of that third tag of the trend line that marked others Bitcoin bottom. So you could even argue that if others Bitcoin drops right here at a point one, that could be the bottom for others Bitcoin. Someone says bear market never ended for all Bitcoin because QT never ended. Exactly, right? It's not about what we want to happen. It's just like, if QT continues, all Bitcoin pairs go down. In 2018, the peak was in Q1, right? The peak was in 2017 for Bitcoin. For total market cap, it might have been January. Yeah, very early January 2018. Yeah. Does ITC Premium offer insights on how to diversify among different cryptos within Bitcoin and ETH? We do have sort of different alerts areas for altcoins, people who care more about those, and we have other ones for higher market cap coins. So yes, we do. Um, but I think the coolest thing is that if there's a crypto that you're interested in, you can go over here to the asset filter and then just filter by that asset. Like if you're really interested in XRP, you can just go sort by XRP charts, and then you can click on something, let's say like ROI after the cycle bottom, and it just pulls it up for XRP. So that's the cool thing about it is you can look at what sort of the coins that you're interested in and filter by those, right? If you're interested in Solana, then you can click on Solana and then it'll show you, here's the running 1 year ROI of Solana. And I don't talk about all that stuff very much, but it is there. Someone says XRP is trash. Look, guys, here's the thing. Here's the thing. At the end of the day, all altcoins, for the most part, are just bleeding against Bitcoin, right? Over the macro scale. We can accept that. So accept that. And everyone who basically everyone is of the understanding that like if you hold an altcoin, it's the best thing in the world, and if you don't hold it, it's a scam. The reality is with something like XRP, I know a lot of people don't like it, but if you just looked at the double bottom that it had on its Bitcoin pair, it was a pretty good way to at least make a nice 4 or 5x move, right? A nice 4 to 5x move. We talked about that on ITC Premium, right? I said back when it was around 600, 700 sats, which was right around here, that it would likely get this move. So it's not about whether you like it or not, right? I mean, you can hate XRP all you want, but if you make 4x, 5x off of it on a move like this, who cares if you don't like it? No, does it matter? Does it matter if it's a 3x move on XRP or some other alt? I don't think so. Don't marry an altcoin. Be indifferent to them. They're a way to increase the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio. And if you think about it like that, the cryptoverse gets a lot easier. If you marry an altcoin, the cryptoverse will remain hard forever. Yeah, Meta call. That was the one. That was the obvious one in 2022 was Meta. That was like the only stock I like recommended back then was because I was just like, guys, like, you know, other than index funds, I normally just stick to low expense ratio index funds, but the only individual stock I looked at back then was Meta. 'Cause I'm like, guys, this is a great opportunity. Since then, I got interested in Tesla around 140. I made a mistake on Tesla this cycle, because I was bearish on Tesla here and here and here and here. You're like, oh, how's that a mistake? I was also bearish on it here. That was my mistake. So what I did was I got my face ripped off by Tesla through here. And then when it put on a macro higher low, I pivoted my view. I didn't wait for it to go down here and put in a new low. I just said here at 140, 150, I was wrong about this. I'm going to be wrong about things. And it's time to flip bullish on it. And it's done pretty well ever since. We get things wrong. It's okay, right? It's okay. But the thing about when you are wrong, you have to pivot. And if you don't pivot, then the market leaves you behind, right? I mean, imagine if I had just said, "Oh, it's going to go back down here, and I'm going to wait for that." I'd still be waiting, which is why I didn't do that. Um, I think Tesla, it looks a lot kind of like what it did last cycle, where it had this sort of this peak, and then it had this capitulation wick, and then eventually it went up to the 1.618. So I wouldn't be that surprised if it eventually made it up there. But that doesn't mean it can't go to say, back to the bull market swap end first. I mean, it did that actually as it rallied. It had this rally up to basically the prior high, which is what it just did, and then it got a pullback back down to around the bull market swap end, which maybe is what it's doing right now, which would correspond to around 340 if it were to drop that low. But again, I mean, this is what I was looking for with ETH, right? Sort of this higher low structure to eventually break and form a macro higher low. And ETH just never did it, right? It never did it. Now, could it be doing it now? Maybe. You still have the higher low structure, right? Is it going to break down here? Is the question. I don't know. I will say that, I mean, it's 2025 and ETH at 2,500. It's probably going to be seen as relatively good value in a few years, But if it does break down like Tesla did, like if ETH does, let's say it rallies back up here and then it kind of comes back down, I wouldn't wait for it to go down here because you would probably just see a macro higher low before it goes back up, is what I would guess would happen. It'll be interesting to see what the market does on the open tomorrow, especially as the labor market data comes in this week. This has definitely been a wake up call for the market, though, for all Bitcoin pairs. Um, I'm much more attuned to this trend line here than I used to be. That's for sure. So as long as this trend line remains intact, you could even argue the status quo remains the same, and we're just still doing the same thing. It's just a little bit more volatility this cycle than last cycle, right? Last cycle, what happened is all Bitcoin pairs sort of got this same drop right here after like a month after the Fed or a month after the Bank of Japan raised rates, and then they sort of bounced back up to the bull market support band, and then they slowly came back down, right? So you could see something like that happen where they sort of bounce up and then slowly come back down. But if they ever are at 0.25, I don't know if they would really go that much lower from there. Where is the bull market support band? For Bitcoin, it is, good question, 87 to 88K. So not too much lower than where we currently are. Basically, right around the prior range low at this point, right? Right around that prior range low is where that bull market support band is coming up to. Can I tell you how I learned all these things? I mean, a lot of the all Bitcoin pair stuff was just living through it the hard way. Not because I was a genius, just going through a cycle and watching it happen, and not willing to watch it happen again while I hold my alts and they bleed against Bitcoin, right? If we continue the bull market, do you think XRP can make a new all-time high? If we get a normal right translated cycle where Bitcoin peaks in Q4, then it would be possible for sure that XRP could hit a new all-time high. It's just a matter of, do we get a right translated cycle or not? If it's right translated, it's a good chance it would. If it's left translated, then the odds are not as good. That's why we follow the macro stuff, because the macro stuff gives us insight into what could theoretically happen, with sort of the bigger picture items. All right, guys. I think we're gonna wrap it up. Because I still have to do the premium video tonight for ICC, so I gotta go work on that. But anyways, we're gonna wrap it up. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on ITC Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye. And subscribe. Video thumbs up.